Hello, welcome to the Jenkins workshop. So the goal of this workshop is to get you up and running in setting up Jenkins so that you can play around with a live instance and just see what it's like. I will also be demonstrating a couple of concepts related to Jenkins, as well as providing some hints for how to automate the installation of Jenkins. So the first thing that you want to do after importing or cloning this repository is download the Jenkins image. So I'm not going to run this step because I already have it. And this is a pretty large image. This is about 1.7 gigs or so, mainly just because it has a bunch of stuff that you need for running Jenkins. And what's interesting about this image is that we built it using Packer. So if you want to check out the details of that, you can see this the script that was run for building this image. But anyway, it has everything all packaged up in this image. We just need to provision a server with it. So I'm going to run this command to create my Jenkins server. And notice I'm going to bump up the memory a little bit because this could be, you basically will see some weird issues if you run it with 1 gig where it's just going to do some weird stuff and it's really not predictable. So I always recommend having at least 2 gigs for Jenkins. And if you're running a job that involves Java, then you might want it as much as 4 gigs. It's just as a minimum. All right, so this is booting up. And so that should only take a couple more seconds. But anyways, out of the box, the Jenkins server is not going to be ready for use. There's actually a couple of things that need to be set up manually. And when you automate the full installation of Jenkins, you'll have to figure out a way how to do this on your own. But I think it's still helpful to go through what the manual steps would be like just to see, what is it that's actually going on. So the first part that you'll notice is if you try to open up Jenkins, that when, and that's probably still starting up the service, so it's not fully loaded yet, but let's go ahead and get into the machine since we're waiting. And one of the first things that you're going to need to do is you actually need to get the initial password for the administrator to get into the machine. And so this is placed in this location. So I'm going to run this so that I can grab whatever that password can be. All right, looks like I jumped the gun a little bit. See, Jenkins is still running. It hadn't even run that step for generating that. Okay, so passwords here. All right, so I'm just going to pause this for a second just to let it finish doing its thing. All right, so Jenkins is finished loading up. Then you see this screen that's prompting for me to put the initial admin password. So this is the one I got from the file on the server. And I'm going to click through. So this next part is interesting because if you think about what Jenkins is, it's kind of a generic software for building pipelines and build jobs. But in itself, it doesn't really know how to do anything. It doesn't really know how to build software or, run, it's not a build manager, for example. And so it mostly outsources everything to plugins. So in this step, I would actually just suggest doing the suggested plugins just to get a sense of what some of them are. But in practice, you don't really need all of these. You probably want a couple of them. I think the most interesting ones are the pipeline one, maybe the Git one, definitely the workspace cleanup, because you'll see that later. And the pipeline stage view, that was interesting. But for the most part, you can do without a lot of these plugins. But these plugins basically will make Jenkins better. There are like thousands of plugins. If you go into the plugins page, when you configure things, there's kind of a whole site that lets you search for the different plugins. So that's I mean, this is a full-time job. If you want to learn how to configure Jenkins in an enterprise sense, or for your company, learning about all those plugins and how to configure them and update them, keep you busy. All right, so this doesn't usually take too long. One thing that you may notice time to time is that some of the plugins actually won't install. Like there will be like a red X, and you can actually ask it to refresh and retry again. And that's something that you may have to be aware of when you automate this, that the plugins may not actually install. And so that's kind of one more pain in the butt thing to be on the lookout for. All right, so the plugins have installed, and then I'm getting to my third step now, where it's asking me to create my admin user. So this is really the one that should be used in place of whatever that initial admin password is. Like this should be the the main user that's being used. And now, while I'm mainly typing this in, you'll want to obviously automate this, and I'll show you how to do that when we're done going through this. Okay, and this last step is just saying, where is this Jenkins URL going to live? And for the most part, this makes sense. This is going to be the IP address of the server in 8080. There are times where you would want to change this port because it will be, maybe there's something local running, like a web app that wants to bind to 8080, and it just gets to be too problematic to kind of have those things collide. So you probably will have to change this. And there is usually an INI file or a configuration file for changing this when you automate this setup. Okay, so this is all ready to go. And this should take me to the Jenkins homepage. Okay, so I want to pop back to the notebook and point out a couple things. So for one, when you automate the installation of the plugins, there's actually a really useful Ansible module called Jenkins plugin that just lets you specify the name of the plugin that you want, and it will help you install that plugin. So this is a really nice way to automate that. The main problem is that the name of this plugin is not always super clear. So you kind of have to do some reverse engineering to figure out what this name is and kind of do research on that. For the third item, when we created that admin user, there are lots of different ways to set up stuff for Jenkins. But one thing that seems to have worked fairly well in the past is to inject a Groovy file into the configuration settings for Jenkins. So a lot of Jenkins works internally with Groovy, and it kind of has like this plugin architecture where you could just drop Groovy files to just run Jenkins related stuff. And so in this case, what we're doing is we're essentially just running the Jenkins code for creating, here's like the key thing right here, where we're creating the account with this, the password admin. So here you could do something similar where you could use a script like this to set up the account for your user. All right. So before playing around with Jenkins itself, I have a little slide deck that I want to walk through that will help explain some of the things going on in Jenkins before we finish running some stuff. Okay, so first, It helps to know a little bit about the history. So originally Jenkins was created in 2004. Kosuke um, had created a project called Hudson while he was working at Sun. And as you can imagine, that Sun did nothing good with this project and kind of just let it do its thing. But eventually, at some point, when Oracle took over Java from Sun, they also took over this project and they officially forked it and renamed it Jenkins. And I think at that point is really where it started taking off. Meanwhile, what sort of happened is Oracle, just like it did with Java, didn't do a good job being a steward of that project. And so what you sort of saw happening was there was kind of a third-party company called CloudBees that started to focus on this idea of offering enterprise or commercial Jenkins. And they hired away all the core developers, including Kotsuki as the CTO. And so ever since CloudBees has been a thing, they've done a really good job of just kind of contributing back to Jenkins and making a hosted enterprise Jenkins a real thing. And that really continues to this day. And then at some point in 2016, Jenkins 2 was released, which really was a big paradigm shift for Jenkins, where they started introducing this idea of pipelines um, as code, which is kind of a nicer script model for doing build jobs. And you will see some of that in a couple slides. So when you log into the Jenkins screen, there are a couple key things that you'll see all the time. And you can just click around. It's not too confusing, but I like to kind of give a high level overview of some of these things. So on the left side, you'll see a dashboard that is going to be kind of like a quick access for a couple of different things that you might do. So I'm gonna highlight the ones that you probably would use. So the new item is basically what you would do to manually create a new build job. The people item is usually where you can create like a new user like the admin, as well as assign roles and permissions for who can see which jobs, etc. The build history is really useful for if you need to go back and see the history of the build jobs that were happening on your server and digging into all the details of that. Probably the main place that you would play around with if you're manually building a Jenkins server is the managed Jenkins um, link, because it basically will take you to another page with a whole bunch of options for setting things like credentials or just global settings and configuration for plugins and all that stuff. So that's a whole jungle for itself. But for the most part, you shouldn't have to tweak too much of those things. In terms of when you're a user of Jenkins, I would say the two things that you, or really the three things you pay attention to most are probably the build queue, just to see what jobs are waiting but not yet running, and to look at the status of your environments that are running it. So these are the build executors. If you configure this to run on an external server or container, etc., then you're going to want to see that to make sure they're online, because it could be that they got knocked off somehow. They crashed, and you want to know that. So you can see that information here. And then the one that everyone's going to be looking at is the build job dashboard, where basically you see a blue ball for indicating a successful build, though some people configure this to have a green or red ball. This weather symbol, which basically represents kind of a trend of your builds, like you'll see like a cloudy, stormy thing if you're kind of failing all the time, and a partially cloudy if you mostly build, but you have a couple build failures. So this is kind of a trend visualization. And then some stats about when things were last run and how long that they ran. So pretty useful if you have lots of jobs where you need a quick overview of what's going on. When you click the new build item, you're going to be confronted with this idea of like, the different types of projects or build jobs that you can have. And obviously lots of different options, but I'd point out two that are of interest to us. One is the Freestyle project, which is really just a kind of no opinions version of a project that lets you just plug in essentially just arbitrary scripts like shell scripts and other types of things that you could do to run a project. And this is pretty good for if you don't know what you're going to do yet. There are more specialized projects, for example, like a Maven project that work really well if you have a generic Java project and you're just going to be using Maven, and you can pass it the goals that you want to run, and it sort of knows how to process things like the tests that are going to be run when you run Maven tests, so it parses the output better. So that's actually one of the advantages of having a specialized build job is it usually selects better plugins um, and reports that know how to deal with the output better. Versus if you have a generic project, it doesn't really know what you're doing under the hood. And so you're just going to get a generic output and a generic experience. The one that's pretty interesting is the pipeline type, which is probably the one that we're going to try doing, which is basically using the new pipeline language for being able to specify stages and actions. And we'll show those in a bit. When you actually click on a job page, you'll see a couple things. So there's going to be, again, this kind of dashboard thing. And I think there's a couple things that are of interest. So one is this changes, which usually corresponds to your whatever your source control system was. Like say if it was GitHub and you say you received a commit, this is a good chance for you to click on that and to see like what was the change that triggered this build or was associated with this build. And that's pretty useful for diagnosing issues. The second one that's really important to point out is this idea of workspaces. So workspaces are kind of like the file system or kind of like the little staging area for your build. So when you run the build and you're running commands, it's all going to happen in this location, in this folder. And after the build, that is still around. And in fact, if you don't configure the workspace cleanup plugin, then whatever was there from an old build would still remain. And that's actually an issue. So you kind of have to think about how to manage that, make sure you avoid job pollution from prior builds being run. But basically, this is your little workspace for running your builds, and you kind of have to be a good steward and make sure that that's cleaned up appropriately. But it's still useful for inspecting a build that failed, and you can poke around the files and look around. If you need to inspect the job itself or edit it in some way, then this configure option is really useful. You probably will be playing with this a lot, and that's basically how you edit the build job itself. And finally, if you want to see status of the build, get current build output or see old builds, there's going to be this build history. And if you click on the build number, it will take you to the output page. And then you can see the build results and other things. So when you click on an actual build result, you'll see something like this, where you'll see like a raw log that's being run from things. And then you may also see, depending on plugins that you have, things like a report or a multi-stage view of the things that we're running inside the build itself. A couple of other interesting build concepts while we're on this topic is this idea of triggers. So how exactly was the build started? So when you configure the build, you usually have a couple options here, but really they come down to, are you pushing or pulling? So are you waiting for some external source to send you a curl request, which Jenkins can listen to and then run something? Or are you kind of just asking, GitHub every 5 minutes, did you change? Did you change? And then if the answer is yes, then it will pull the changes in and then start running the build job. So all sorts of different plugins and options for doing this. But for the most part, there's a pretty standard way to do this. You don't want to overpull because we definitely had some issues with that in the past. Um, so another interesting thing is credentials. So Jenkins provides a way to globally manage credentials for your server. And you could kind of constrain this into certain groups. But what will happen is you can basically use this for if you have secrets or passwords that you need to access from the job, but you don't want kind of stored in plain text and you don't want the build logs to have those things. By having it be a credential, then you could inject this into the runtime environment of the build job. Usually it's exposed as a environment variable, but there are other options for this. And then you could write your build job logic so that it can access these credentials. So this is pretty useful. You probably will have to do this at some point. Um, Another useful concept is this idea of a post build, which is the steps that occur after a successful build. So inside a build job, there's usually like an area for filling out steps related to this. And one typical thing that you might do is run like a publishing report, or you might publish some reports or build artifacts, or you may trigger a further thing like a deployment strategy, right? So there's all sorts of things you could do downstream after you successfully built. When you actually look into the details of what a build job is, and you click on, say, that configure build job page, you'll get something that looks like this, where there's a whole bunch of kind of options and fields for you to fill out. And the reality is, this is really just a pretty presentation of a big, ugly XML file that's behind the scenes. And that's always what Jenkins really has been. And if you think of it, and when you really look at what's in these things, it's usually just some parameters that you can provide for various plugins that you have. And if you think of it, it kind of reminds you of what Maven did, right? So Maven just kind of has a whole bunch of, stages and other things that you can run, goals, but you're really just providing parameters for other plugins to run, right? So this really declarative XML mess. And then, yeah, you can kind of use this UI to help you update this. But I would argue that no one is happy messing with build jobs like this. There has to be a better way to do this. So I would say what Jenkins 2 did helps a lot, at least for the main build logic part of things, is where they started introducing this domain specific language for describing the build job. And you can see a couple examples of this, and you can kind of see a sense of like the different parameters you can fill in here on the right. Let me just jump to this example on the left, where here's a pipeline where it says it could run on any server, that like any build agent, and it kind of has a list of stages. And in this case, it's just the test stage. And it says there are 2 steps. The first step is to run make check. And the second stage is to run JUnit with these given XML files. Right? So that's just how this is done. But you can imagine this can get really complicated, or as complicated as you want. So for example, in this one, it's cloning from GitHub and then configuring Maven, running Maven build, and then publishing information about the build, right? So this could be really complicated. The other thing that's fun about Jenkins pipelines is they couldn't quite figure out which to commit to a real thing, in the sense of that they have 2 different ways of doing this. So they call it scripted versus declarative pipelines. So in the declarative pipelines, it's kind of the styles that you see here. They kind of have this little language that lets you declare things. It's a little bit more constrained in what you can do, versus the scripted version of the pipelines lets you do more arbitrary groovy code, and it it isn't clear which is the right way to do it, and you'll see both examples. And there are some things that work in one version versus not the other. So that's kind of the messy part of Jenkins 2 pipelines. They're still kind of figuring this out to this day. So if you remember, we talked about Jenkins being XML under the hood. Sort of an alternative way to do this is to say, I know, let's use YAML. So there's actually a really cool tool for doing this, Jenkins Job Builder. And it's sort of was built by a third party to do this because, I think IBM did this, or I forget who the original one was to do this, but obviously someone that had to do a lot of Jenkins jobs and was tired of messing with Jenkins and whatever its strategy was for dealing with code or automating these things. And so they actually created this nice little interface where you can say things like, here is the source control that I have, and here's the builder I want to use, and here's the name of the project, and the project type is Freestyle. And then I just run Jenkins job update with this YAML file, and then it will create this YAML, or it will create this job inside Jenkins. It's actually a really nice way to set up things. Now, and I would argue this is the easiest way if you want to automate the creation of a job in Jenkins. Now, whether this is the most expressive or best way to write it, the problem is that there aren't a lot of examples in this. In fact, a lot of times what you have to do is you have to go into Jenkins Job Builder's test suite to find all the examples of how to do this. So since then, there have been a little bit more guides out there. So there's this recent blog post that goes through a pretty good job of explaining Jenkins Job Builder. So that one's good. But the other thing I like to point out is that the pipeline style works well in Jenkins Job Builder too, where you literally just say, I have a project type pipeline, and then you just give it the pipeline code and you just feed it right in. And for me, this is the best of both worlds. So you have this nice way of creating the job, and you can take advantage of the nice language that's provided by the pipelines. There is a third thing that you can do, and I think also works well, but it's called using a Jenkins file. And it's basically just having this content here and putting it inside of a project and calling it Jenkins, and then there's a certain term, a project type that you use for that. The one reason I don't recommend that is that a lot of times you need to build a repository that you don't have full access to, or you can't quite put all the logic that you need in an open source public way. You might need to have your own private kind of process for building something. And while I think that works for some projects, I think for the things that we're doing, I really recommend doing this approach for building our stuff. And so that's why we go that way in the project. But there's a wide possibility here for how to do this. So one thing I like to point out is if once you have a Jenkins server up and running, then you often may need to debug what's inside of it. And I think the key directory is the var lib Jenkins directory, because it has everything that you want. It has the config XML, which is the main settings for everything in Jenkins. It has the job directories of all the build jobs and all its configuration files that you can poke around in, some log files that are useful, all the plugins that you have, et cetera, right? So if you needed to really dig into like the workspace of a particular job and see like what was happening here, then going into the jobs directory and its workspace and checking out everything there, really useful. I just want to leave you off with, if you wanted a high level overview of kind of all the concepts related to Jenkins, there are a couple books on this, and we actually covered quite a few of these already. But here's just kind of a quick high-level view of some of the things that we talked about and some things that you may need to see in more detail. And the books are a good resource for that. There are also more advanced concepts, and I just want to point out one example, which is just parameterized builds. So you can configure build jobs to accept variables. So a good example of this is, imagine you had a request to build on a different branch. Then you could have the branch be a parameter. And so you could have an external request, which will say, I either want to trigger a build on master or a build on dev. And based on that, then the build job is going to do something different, right? So there's a whole bunch of other things that you can do with Jenkins, all the way down to doing full enterprise level stuff where you're running thousands of build jobs and distributed across hundreds of executors, and have all sorts of security and authentication for how users could log in. And so it can be pretty wild for how that goes. So I think that's enough for this. And I want to just finish up with now going back to Jenkins and showing you, let's actually see something in action. And so one of the first things that we're going to do is we're just going to create a Freestyle project. So I'm going to go here and I'm just going to call this free. Click the Freestyle project button. Okay. All right, and there's all these options I could put, but the one I'm going to go straight down to is add build step and then execute shell. And I'm going to paste in something real simple, where I'm just going to clone a repo, cd into it, and then run npm install and npm test. And in case you didn't recognize this, this is basically the same thing that we did in our build workshop, right? So I'm going to save this. And I could then just click build now, which will be a manual trigger. And you can see this appear here. And I can go ahead and click this and click on the console output. Then I can see the build log streaming for me. So it looks like it already did the clone and that worked okay. And it's running npm install right now. And you can see where the workspace is, right? So it's in that var lib Jenkins jobs, the free job, and then it's workspace, right? So this is where all these commands are being run. And if you look at it, it looks like everything was successful. All right, that was pretty cool. So, this is basically how you would use Jenkins in an everyday manner, right? It's just an easy way for you to run jobs, hook it up to other events, and let other people see it. So I want to show you how to do the same thing, but using two different things. One is how to use the Jenkins Job Builder, which is already installed on this VM. And there's already a file here. So I'm going to show you this here, where it just has this declaration, and it's basically just saying, I want to have a 3-step thing where I first clone, then run npm install, and then run npm test, right? So this is basically the same thing that I did before, but it's using the pipeline syntax. So let's run Jenkins job. And it seems that it has ran okay. And I should be able to go to the dashboard, refresh this, and I can see my new test pipeline. All right, so that's pretty cool. So instead of manually triggering the build, I want to show you a pretty cool trick of where we're going to actually be using Node.js to run the install, right? To trigger the build. And that's actually part of the project of where you're required to trigger the build. So I want to show you this running. So this is just using the Jenkins package. And this is included in this repo. So you should be able to see it. And I'm just going to print this out so you can see what it looks like. So you can see it's using the Jenkins npm package. It's configured some stuff already. And on the whole, essentially what it's doing is it's using this API to send a request to build a job for the test pipeline job, right? So let's just try to see if we can get that to work. So I'm clicking this and let's see what happens. Okay, well, that's promising. So I could see that that job was indeed triggered. So I could see the console just like before. Where's few? All right, but what's cool about this, because this is a pipeline and I have the stage view available, I can actually see each stage being run for where it's already completed the git clone, and then it runs the npm install, and then it ran npm test. And then you can kind of see how long each one did, which is pretty cool. And it'll actually show the same thing here on the main page of the build job. Now that this is completed, I should be able to go back here and I can see the result of this. So you could see that this code was able to receive the output of that command. And it basically looks like this was successful, right? So using everything I just showed you, you have kind of the tools you need to automatically install Jenkins and automatically configure it, then be able to do a couple things like automatically create a build job and then automatically trigger it. So what's pretty cool about this is if you were in an enterprise environment where you wanted to be able to automatically set up a Jenkins environment for someone and then to automatically configure build jobs for them, this is, you basically have the tooling for that. And I can tell you that CloudBees charges quite a large amount of money to do what you're doing in this workshop automatically for people, right? So think of this as like this was step one for you replicating what CloudBees does. All right, so that should be good for this workshop.